On the one hand, it is the last gasp of arms control left over from the Cold War, when there was some mutual interest in controlling the extent of strategic weapons. On the other hand, it's the continuation of a long trend where there's been less and less constraint on how these two countries and other countries around the world are actually able to arm themselves. Now, of course, this was always primarily a constraint on the United States. And in that respect, sometimes you can understand some of the relaxation that we've heard from some American commentators about what exactly this means. But the lapsing of New START is not the only dangerous trend within nuclear proliferation. There's also, of course, the fact that European countries are more and more facing public discussions about whether they need to develop their own nuclear deterrents in a new world where they may be questioning the value of American protection under extended deterrence. And they've also seen how when countries are victim of Russian aggression, then the United States may not be willing to protect them against Russia to the full extent of its capabilities.
US and Russia no longer have limits on their nuclear arsenals. What does it indicate for global security? Is it possible that US troops will be deployed in Ukraine according to American security guarantees? And how could be solved territorial issue, the most difficult one in current negotiations? All of this I'm going to discuss with my guest, British writer and security expert, Keir Giles. Welcome, Keir.
Thank you. Hello.
As I said in the beginning, now US and Russia no longer have limits on their nuclear arsenals because on February 5, 2026, the Strategic Offensive Arms Treaty between the United States and Russia legally expired. What does it indicate for global security, and how could events develop in terms of this treaty prolongation?
It's been a curious mix of alarm and unconcern at the lapsing of this treaty, depending on which arms control expert or which political international security expert you ask about this. On the one hand, it is the last gasp of arms control left over from the Cold War, when there was some mutual interest in controlling the extent of strategic weapons. On the other hand, it's the continuation of a long trend where there's been less and less constraint on how these two countries and other countries around the world are actually able to arm themselves. Now, of course, this was always primarily a constraint on the United States. And in that respect, sometimes you can understand some of the relaxation that we've heard from some American commentators about what exactly this means. But the lapsing of New START is not the only dangerous trend within nuclear proliferation. There's also, of course, the fact that European countries are more and more facing public discussions about whether they need to develop their own nuclear deterrents in a new world where they may be questioning the value of American protection under extended deterrence. And they've also seen how when countries are victim of Russian aggression, then the United States may not be willing to protect them against Russia to the full extent of its capabilities. So all of this is a toxic mix of which the New START treaty lapsing is only just one element.
After the full-scale invasion, I have noticed that thanks to Russia, nuclear weapon transformed from weapon of deterrence to weapon of intimidation, or if you would like, weapon of blackmail. First of all, I mean Oreshnik. I would like to ask you, how do you assess probability of Russia using tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine and strategic against USA?
The probability of Russia using a nuclear weapon of any kind other than as an information tool remains extremely low. Russia doesn't need to use nuclear weapons to get what it wants. We've seen also a complete transformation in the way in which Russia is exerting nuclear intimidation since the change of administration in the United States. There's no longer a requirement to use the tool of nuclear threats to coerce the Biden administration when the Trump administration is perfectly willing to offer Russia what it wants in any case. So the whole dynamic around nuclear intimidation has changed, but the underlying fact remains that there are very, very few circumstances, and none of them close to what we see today, under which using a nuclear weapon would make Russia's circumstances better, not worse.
Yeah, but actually, we know that during the whole period of Russian aggression, the main thing that USA and Europe want to avoid, and it is the biggest fear, as we know, it's direct confrontation with Russia, what can lead to nuclear war. So why USA and Europe are ready to allow this confrontation now in order to security guarantees for Ukraine?
I don't think there's any real likelihood of the United States, in particular, being willing to confront Russia in the manner in which you're describing. The notion of US security guarantees is something that's deeply mysterious to people who are following the so-called peace process and the negotiations under which the United States is trying to coerce Ukraine into surrender. What exactly this may mean is open to question, particularly because Donald Trump has said these security guarantees are conditional on Russia not violating a ceasefire. So the assumption that a ceasefire will hold and Russia will agree to something it is not willing to violate calls the whole of this process into question, because nobody can quite understand how exactly a ceasefire would be enforced. The United States is in the same position as it was previously, in the sense that it is unwilling to confront Russia, just for different reasons. And Europe, of course, was never fully convinced of these Russian nuclear threats. It was primarily Germany among the coalition that was attempting to support Ukraine that was convinced by this. Other countries, particularly the frontline states, recognized that this was just an information campaign.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, speaking in Parliament in Kyiv, announced the following mechanism. This is his quote: "The US, Europe, and Canada have agreed to provide security guarantees. As soon as a peace agreement is reached, armed force, aircraft in the air, and support at sea will immediately appear." How would you interpret words of Security General?
Sadly, they are every bit as vague as Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. So armed force will appear, aircraft will appear, warships will appear. Where will they appear and what will they be doing? Those are the key questions. And that is the area of uncertainty which remains. Because unless and until we have some specific idea of what exactly would be guaranteed and who would be providing the security, we simply don't know what security guarantees mean. We've also seen some slightly alarming reporting of how mechanisms would work in terms of monitoring, verification, and enforcing a ceasefire. Suggestions, for example, that within 24 hours of a violation by Russia, there would be a diplomatic response, which most people who've been paying attention to this know from long experience is not considered a meaningful action by Russia.
Financial Times published details of security guarantees project, which allegedly had been agreed by Ukraine and its Western partners. How do you assess potential efficiency and sequence of steps of these security guarantees? As we know, the first step is a reaction of Ukrainian armed force and diplomatic reaction of the Western partners. The second one is European troops on the ground in Ukraine. And the third one, after 70 hours of escalation, we are waiting for American troops on the ground in Ukraine.
That is exactly the sequencing of events I was referring to just now, with a diplomatic response within the first 24 hours and then waiting for further escalation before actually doing anything, which, if this is a genuine reflection of which is what is being discussed, presents, of course, the danger of Russia being able to calibrate what it is doing to sail just below the level at which Europe or even the United States might react. So that's fine for cross-border incursions, cross-border ceasefire violations of the kind that we saw constantly under the Minsk Accords in their various iterations. What happens, for example, if the violation of the ceasefire is not something localized and tactical on the border, but a missile strike on Kyiv? Is that, again, only going to prompt a diplomatic response? And then if after 24 hours everything goes quiet, the process resets to normal? All of these are the questions which people who have observed Russian behavior under ceasefires before are asking about what's been reported about this process.
Yeah, in this context, I would like to ask you one more question. When it comes to response of Western forces on Russian invasion, I see wordings as their armed forces should be in Ukraine and protect Ukraine, not must be in Ukraine and protect Ukraine, or they are obligated to protect. It is not warranted. I mean that wordings should be precise, and don't you foresee that these kind of loopholes would be used by allies to circumvent their direct confrontation with Russia?
That is exactly correct. Loopholes in ceasefire agreements are repeatedly exploited by Russia, particularly when those agreements are drafted in Moscow. And, of course, we've also seen where allies of Ukraine have looked for loopholes to avoid supporting Ukraine to the greatest extent possible. And that lack of clarity, that vagueness about exactly what the commitments are and when they would be triggered, may be being presented by European powers as a potential deterrent for Russia, but actually they are more of an invitation, because testing those boundaries and testing testing those responses is an inevitable part of how Russia will test this ceasefire overall. And what exactly any so-called reassurance forces from European powers are supposed to be doing in Ukraine and what they are equipped to do is a key part of this equation.
Reuters reported that according to its information, Ukraine must first sign a peace agreement with Russia in order to receive security guarantees from the United States. How do you understand logic of this process? And if it's true, why Russia should agree to peace deal if after signification of this peace deal, Ukraine receives efficient security guarantees? After all, everybody realizes that Russia will attack Ukraine again. It's inevitably, in my opinion.
That's exactly right. Looking for the logic in the sequencing, but also the process overall, is a thankless task because so little of it actually applies to situations when you're dealing with Russia and attempting to enforce an end to a Russian war of aggression. So many of the different aspects that we've heard are actually completely unsuitable to the fundamental task of ensuring that Russia would not be able to violate a ceasefire and would not be able to restart the war at a time of its choosing. It's not just the sequencing, it's also the penalties and the consequences for Russia for violation, all of which remain entirely unclear.
I got you. And if I understood correctly, there will be two separate agreements between Ukraine and Russia and between Ukraine and USA. How do you understand global construction of these two peace agreements and how they would work together?
Again, what we're discussing is largely speculative because we don't see exactly what has been agreed. But that question points to a fundamental problem with the process that we have seen so far, that there have been parallel negotiations. The United States is negotiating with Ukraine on what Ukraine will agree to in terms of appeasing the coercion from Russia. Meanwhile, that package is being taken to Russia, who, of course, is willing to confirm or deny, and will probably deny that it will agree to any of these terms. So you've had situations where Presidents Trump and Zelensky are saying that they are 90% close to an agreement, but that seems to be 90% close to an agreement between themselves, which could be 0% of the way towards anything that Russia would agree with. And of course, as soon as you discuss European or NATO troops being present as a reassurance force in Ukraine to ensure that a peace agreement holds, that of course is something that Russia is extremely unlikely to agree to, because it is precisely the situation that in Russia's presentation of world events, they went to war to avoid.
How could you describe Russian current strategy in terms of peace process? What does Putin want to achieve, and how does he try to use Abu Dhabi peace talks?
There seems still to be an assessment in the Kremlin that Russia can gain more from continuing to grind forward on the front line and to pummel Ukrainian cities than from accepting what is being presented to them by the United States. There may be a calculation that eventually, possibly sometime soon, Russia might finally be able to achieve Ukrainian capitulation because it has finally made life unsustainable in Ukraine's major cities. Now, whether or not that is correct, we have no way of telling, because that requires understanding precisely what these assessments are based on within the Kremlin and what they think their long-term chances of sustaining this war are. But for the time being, there doesn't seem to be any prospect of getting closer to a ceasefire agreement unless one of two things happen. Unless there is that Ukrainian capitulation because Russia has finally succeeded in making it impossible to survive, or there is major pressure put on Russia itself by external actors to bring the war to an end by some other means.
Do you foresee any significant result from these peace talks, or everything will be limited to technical and humanitarian issues as prisoners of war exchange?
That's example. Exactly what has happened in previous iterations where there have been the face-to-face talks. And at the moment, I don't see any indications that there is a likelihood of it extending beyond that during the current round either.
Yeah, because undoubtedly prisoners of war exchange is a very important issue, but I'm talking about ceasefire or war stop, about global things. Yeah,
exactly. There seems to have been a collective hallucination across Western media and indeed Western governments that a peace settlement is very close, and furthermore that it will be a lasting and a durable one, and it will be something that will make not just Ukraine but Europe as a whole more safe, not less safe. All of this, of course, is completely incorrect.
In your opinion, how could be solved territorial issue, the most difficult issue in the negotiation process? We know that Kiev and Moscow have absolutely different views on it, and no one is ready to surrender.
That's exactly right, which is, of course, just one of the reasons why the war continues. And again, it depends entirely on those two factors that might bring about a peace settlement. Either Russia has finally, God forbid, been successful in ensuring that Ukraine cannot survive, and therefore capitulation and surrender of these territories is the only way for Ukraine to remain intact, or pressure is brought on Russia to amend its demands. As long as neither of those two things happen, we're going to be still in this situation where nothing will move.
We see that Trump is satisfied with Putin. Trump said that Putin kept his word about so-called energy truce. But we understand that Putin just used shell and break for collecting drones and missiles to strike Ukraine in the most extreme cold. How could evolve Trump-Putin relations further in terms of US pressure on Russia?
Well, if there is US pressure on Russia, it's unlikely to come from Donald Trump. What we see instead is Trump providing every possible excuse to Russia, including for violations of an energy truce, including for all of the different actions that Russia has taken over time, frustrating, of course, and mocking Trump's efforts to bring the war to an end by pointing out how valueless they are to the Kremlin itself. There's no sign that that process too will change, because there's no sign that despite the occasional verbal outbursts, Trump is willing to do anything to put pressure on Moscow.
And the last question, Keir. How do you assess Russian military, economic, and political capabilities to conduct long-term war of attrition? I mean, what is changing in terms of these capabilities at the moment?
There's no doubt that in the long term, Russia will not be able to sustain its current level of effort at the risk of permanent damage to its economy, to its demography. The problem, of course, is surviving the short and medium term. Now, there's been a great deal of optimism about how Russia would soon run out of money or of men or of military equipment. None of those forecasts have actually come to pass, and Russia does seem to be able to grind through the manpower that it is expending on the front, as well as, of course, bringing in people from third countries to try to fill the gaps in its ranks and still grow its armed forces and its strategic reserve. So we should not count on the optimistic forecasts that Russia is going to stop, even if there is the economic collapse within Russia that some of our foremost economists have actually looked forward to. That in itself would not necessarily mean an immediate end to the fighting. So pressure on Kremlin decision-making has to come from elsewhere.
Keir, thank you very much for this interview. I appreciate your expertise. Thanks again, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.